Welcome to History Nachos. We do things a little differently. Names and dates take a back seat to humanity's greatest real stories. So sit back and enjoy the ride. In the early 8th century, Islamic expansion crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain. The Spanish were overrun and forced to retreat to their strongholds in the northern mountains. Now the invaders had an open corridor into the very heart of Europe. Realizing the direness of their situation, Christian Europe began to fight for its life. The struggle to liberate Spain would last nearly 800 years. It would begin in the Dark Ages following the fall of Rome and end months before the first voyage to the New World. Inch by inch, the Spanish paid in blood to reclaim their homeland. This was the Western world's first great struggle for survival after Rome. It was time to sink or swim. This is the epic tale of when the tide turned. Welcome to Episode 9, The Reconquista. There is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance. Ronald Reagan. That quote comes out of the iconic speech, A Time for Choosing, from 1964. At that time, America faced the existential threat of the Soviet Union's constant expansion backed by atomic weapons. Reagan's whole speech concerned the wide series of choices America faced, including how to handle the Soviet Union. When the forces of Islam crossed into Spain, they forced Christian Europe to make a similar decision: survive or surrender. This episode is both a prequel and a sequel to the last episode on the First Crusade. The Reconquista and the Crusades are two fronts in the same series of tensions and conflicts lasting nearly a millennium. Also, for practical reasons, I'm going to focus mainly on the beginning and the end. Otherwise, this would become a full-on audiobook. The middle part is full of complex drama and intrigue that looks like Game of Thrones on steroids. So I will provide resources at the end for those of you that want to dig into it more. The story behind the Reconquista actually starts a century before Islamic armies set foot in Spain. In the early 600s, a man in Arabia believed he was communicating with the divine. He also believed his God commanded him to spread the religious message far and wide. We know him as Muhammad. How much of Muhammad's story you consider true depends on your religious beliefs. Here is what we know for sure. The first people to hear Muhammad's message were Arabs, and Islam caught on fast in Arabia. The Arabs had a formidable warrior culture, so they combined Muhammad's expansionist message with Arab fighting ability. The idea proved so effective that it acquired a formal name: jihad. What logically came next is now called the early Islamic conquests. Islam made a huge entrance onto the world stage. Before the Arabs expanded outward, most of the Middle East had lived under Christian governments for centuries under the Romans and their successors, the Byzantines. Over the course of the 600s, Islam expanded across the Middle East and North Africa. When the Arabs took over territory, life changed drastically. If your area resisted, you would be very lucky just to survive. That was nothing new. The change-up came from surrendering. The normal surrender deal was to give up, pay taxes to a new king, and maybe get some different laws. But life went on. As the Who so eloquently put it, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. However, if your area surrendered to Islam, the new management came in and re-geared the whole society to Islam. Instead of the usual deal, it was more like getting taken over by the Borg from Star Trek. You will be assimilated, resistance is futile. It should be noted that forced conversion was forbidden under the Quran, so conversion was not technically forced, but it was heavily incentivized. Non-Muslims could still practice their faith, but under the new system, they faced open discrimination and extra taxes. Within a couple of generations, there were a lot more Muslims in the formerly Christian Middle East. The most important area for this story is Morocco. From Spain, it is just across the Strait of Gibraltar, where Africa and Europe almost touch. Morocco went Muslim in the 680s. By that point, everyone knew about the Islamic expansion, including Spain. Morocco had ocean to the west, desert to the south, and allies to the east. The only way left to expand was north into Spain. Morocco and Spain became uneasy neighbors. Islam was on the rise, and the Middle East was becoming a civilizational powerhouse. Spain, on the other hand, was still in the Dark Ages. Rome had collapsed back in the 400s, so Europe looked like an EMP went off and caused a Mad Max apocalypse. When the Germanic tribes divided up the Western Roman Empire, Spain went to the Vandals. You can hear more about that in the First Crusade episode. And yes, the terms Vandal and Vandalism are named after these dudes. Gives you an idea what post-Roman Europe was like. Anyway, by the 600s, things had relatively leveled out. But going into the 700s, Europe still had a long road ahead before it could pull out of the Dark Ages. In 711, the inevitable happened. Islamic armies crossed Gibraltar and entered Spain. They timed it to invade right after the Spanish king died and a dynastic struggle was going on. The invasion caused everybody in Spain to unite against the Muslim forces. Spain got its act together and geared up for a massive showdown. They quickly put up defenses, gathered for a unified stand, and got smashed by the Muslims. The king and a lot of the nobility were killed. King Rodrigo gets an A for effort, though. Barely a year into his reign, Rodrigo had to manage a civil war and an invasion from a superpower. Some people just get dealt a bad hand. Over the next 5 years, the Muslims took Spain. They renamed the new territory Al-Andalus, which roughly translates to Land of the Vandals. A famous area of southern Spain still bears the name, Andalusia. By the way, from here on out, I'm going to use the term Muslims because people on the Islamic side came from all over the Islamic world. The rank and file were mainly Moors from Morocco, but the leadership often came from Arabia or other parts of the Middle East. There were also native Spaniards who converted to Islam. Muslim is the only acceptable term that covers all of them. Alright, back to the 8th century. The Muslims had taken over Spain. However, they still faced guerrilla warfare in Asturias, a mountainous region on the far northern edge of Spain. Their leader is now a legend to his people, Pelayo. This dude was like a combination of George Washington and Pancho Villa. Pelayo's origin story is a mix of fact and legend, with theories running the gamut from a relative of the Spanish royal family to just some soldier. He probably fought at the main battle where the king died. Pelayo escaped and found his way up to his homeland in northern Spain, Asturias. How and why he got there is another contested subject. The important thing is Pelayo came home, rallied for rebellion, and knew how to lead men into battle. People joined his cause, and the Muslims had an insurgency on their hands in a previously uncontested area. My favorite theory is that Pelayo started a rebellion, got captured, then escaped. This was not a mere run when the guards are not looking escape. This was an escape from the Muslim capital 450 miles behind enemy lines to come back and lead the rebellion again. Pelayo became too much to handle on his home turf. At the Battle of Covadonga, he fought away the Muslims once and for all, then declared Asturias a Christian kingdom. The remaining nobles overwhelmingly elected Pelayo as the first king of Asturias. Pelayo had created a foothold for Christianity in Spain. More importantly, Pelayo showed that the juggernaut of Islam was not invincible. They could be defeated and land could be reclaimed. Muslim forces would never again hold Asturias. The Reconquista had begun. Pelayo continued to hold the line in northern Spain, so the Muslims decided to advance in another direction, like water hitting a big rock. About a decade later, in the early 730s, they crossed the border with France and began another push. The Muslims sacked Bordeaux and got into central France. There is a lot of debate about how big the force was, but it was sizable enough to loot Bordeaux. To the Muslims, France was quickly becoming another Spain. However, a counterpunch was coming. Compared to Spain, France was a whole different ballgame. In post-apocalypse Europe, the Frankish kingdom was basically a dominant biker gang. That really is not an exaggeration, since the modern biker gang culture is very similar to the Franks. I'm talking about hardcore outlaw gangs like Hell's Angels. The Franks were straight-up scary barbarians from eastern France and western Germany. They took over the former Roman province of Gaul and renamed it after themselves. They were also led by one of the best leaders in all of French history, Charles Martel, aka Charles the Hammer. The Muslim offensive caught everyone off guard because things had been relatively calm since the Muslims finished rushing Spain a decade earlier. There was trouble on the border with Spain and occasional raids into France, but that was normal for the time. When Charles the Hammer learned that an all-out Muslim army had encroached on his turf, Charles went into attack mode and issued a call to arms. He and the boys grabbed their weapons and did the medieval equivalent of revving up the choppers and riding out en masse. Charles and his army of biker dudes challenged the Muslims head-on at Tours. Many of the details of the battle are unclear and hotly contested. What we know for sure is that Charles the Hammer and the Franks won pretty decisively. They beat back the Muslims to an area along the Spanish border. The tsunami of Islamic expansion into Western Europe had reached its high watermark. After the Battle of Tours, Charles the Hammer and his biker army turned the tide. It is widely considered one of the most critical turning points in world history. Throughout the 730s, Islamic Spain would attempt several more invasions with even larger forces, but every one was thrown back quickly. Pelayo was even alive to watch part of it. He died in 737, still the king of a Christian Asturias. Pelayo lived to see the results of the Battle of Tours, and he undoubtedly knew what a huge turning point it was. Pelayo's legacy is the modern nations of Spain and Portugal. When Charles the Hammer died in 741, the Spanish border was contested, but France was still in Christian hands. By that point, one thing became clear. The Reconquista was not just a Spanish matter anymore. Charles the Hammer was succeeded by his son, Pepin the Short. Pepin the Short has an amazing story of his own. The brief version is Charles the Hammer split the kingdom between his sons, and Pepin got the part making up much of modern France. From the get-go, Pepin had two main objectives: beat out his brothers for the crown and secure Aquitaine, the region by the Spanish border. Aquitaine was a consistently rebellious area of the Frankish kingdom. Muslims also had territory on the French side of the Pyrenees Mountains, with forward operating bases. Pepin needed to get a lid on the border before things got out of hand. Pepin spent the 740s simultaneously waging war with his brothers and Aquitaine. After a decade, Pepin the Short finally won the power struggle, brought Aquitaine to heel, and got the Pope's endorsement of his reign. Once he secured the crown and locked down Aquitaine, Pepin decided to finish his father's work. Pepin pushed the Muslims back over the Pyrenees and out of modern France. Now a big physical barrier separated the Franks from Islamic Spain. Pepin set the table perfectly for his son to take over. Pepin's kid became a highly skilled leader in his own right, and earned the moniker Charles the Great. You probably know him better by his French name, Charlemagne. Charlemagne had a lot on his plate because he basically led Western Europe, either directly or through influence. However, Charlemagne had learned well the lessons from his dad and grandpa. Make sure the Spanish border is secure. Pepin the Short had won Aquitaine, and Charlemagne made sure to set up the long-term infrastructure, to keep it in line. Charlemagne also took the fight to the Muslims in Spain. The first time Charlemagne had to pull out early to deal with higher priorities. On the second try, he expanded Frankish territory into northeastern Spain and secured the mountain passes across the Pyrenees. By Charlemagne's time, Asturias had also expanded and now included roughly a quarter of Spain from north to south. Between Asturias and the Franks, by the end of the 700s, the bleeding had stopped. After nearly a century of war, things calmed down for a while. Tensions still ran high along the border with Islam, but everyone started settling into the new normal. Much like the Middle East, many Spanish people under Muslim rule converted to Islam. For people who could not afford the extra taxes on Christians, it was the only option. Well, the only option besides fleeing your homeland and hoping for the best. For people who did not strongly believe either way, conversion made life much easier under an Islamic government. Remember, this is mainly based on public representation. What people believed in private is anyone's guess. However, a large amount of people chose to remain Christian anyway. We do not know how many for sure, but it was enough for them to have autonomous communities and neighborhoods in big cities. Even though these people kept their religion, they still learned Arabic, dressed in Middle Eastern clothing, and adopted Middle Eastern cultural customs. This group became known as Mozarabs, which means like Arabs. The Mozarabs largely assimilated into the new Middle Eastern society in Spain. However, as time went on, many chose to relocate to the Christian kingdoms in the north. That is pretty much how things went for the next couple of centuries. The Basque and Catalan homelands were mostly on the Christian side of the border, which meant they were not nearly as influenced by Islam. It is a major reason why those areas have their own cultures distinct from the rest of Spain. To this day, there are independence movements among both Basques and Catalans. Fast forward to the start of the 11th century. Asturias was still going strong, but had expanded and renamed itself Leon. Strong independent areas of Christian Spain had started to break off, but they all still held together in an alliance against the Muslims. The 11th century gets pretty nuts. Islamic power weakened in Al-Andalus, and Christian Spain smelled blood in the water. A big push south began. Politically, Christian Spain looked like Westeros from Game of Thrones. Multiple strong kingdoms fighting each other for power and territory, but still keeping the loose alliance against their main threat intact. Everybody wanted a piece of the action when Muslim territory became up for grabs. The period from 1000 to 1500 in Spain constitutes one of the most complex and intriguing times in history. I could do a whole other podcast series just on this period alone and still barely scratch the surface. For now, I'm just going to give you the gist of it. The Christian kingdoms duked it out with Islamic Spain and each other. They slowly but steadily pushed the Muslims further and further south. This phase is the most famous part of the Reconquista. It also played a large part in forming the Holy War mentality leading into the Crusades. Christians and Muslims constantly relocated to adapt. And that's before I even get started with the intense political intrigue on the Muslim side, the Black Plague, and the Spanish Inquisition. On top of everything else, constant political marriages among the Christian royalty would occasionally result in a kid becoming heir to more than one kingdom. That often created a huge mess, and sometimes erupted into all-out war. By 1400, almost all of Spain was back in Christian hands. Only the southernmost region of Granada remained Muslim. At this point, three main Christian kingdoms remained: Aragon, Castile, and Portugal. Castile and Leon merged early in the Reconquista, so they controlled the most territory and had the best claim to legitimacy from Asturias. Same country, third name. To this day, the traditional form of Spanish is called Castilian. It is basically the English accent of the Spanish-speaking world. In the mid-1400s, two of the most important people in world history entered the scene: Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. Isabella's early life is such an underappreciated story. Her half-brother was King of Castile, and rebellious nobles plotted to depose the king. When Isabella was just 17, the nobles came to Isabella and wanted to put her on the throne. Isabella played it smart and turned down participation in the coup. The king found out and rewarded Isabella by officially declaring her the new heir to the throne. It also saved his hide from more coup attempts. Isabella instantly became one of the most desirable bachelorettes in Western Europe. Her marriage became a huge political topic. The choice really came down to two guys, the King of Portugal and the Crown Prince of Aragon. Isabella decided on Ferdinand of Aragon. It was the best political option. Bonus, Ferdinand was just a year younger than Isabella, while the King of Portugal was more than twice her age. That was not gonna fly for this hot young princess. There were some drawbacks, though. First of all, the king wanted Isabella to marry the King of Portugal. Choosing Ferdinand could have consequences. Ferdinand was also Isabella's second cousin. Then again, so were a lot of the nobles at Isabella's level because of the frequent political marriages in Spain. All weirdness aside, marrying a second cousin required special permission from the Pope. Isabella was able to wire the Pope's approval through her hookup in the Vatican, Rodrigo Borgia. He was a cardinal at the time, but would later become one of the most important popes to ever live. Fascinating guy. Basically, imagine putting Vito Corleone from The Godfather in charge of the UN. With the paperwork squared away, at 18 Isabella eloped with Ferdinand. Both of them were heirs to their respective crowns, and Isabella started bearing children pretty quickly. This was about to get interesting. 5 years later, Isabella's brother died and she took the throne. Not bad for 23. The King of Portugal was still pissed about not getting the final rose and tried to take down Isabella. He backed the dead king's daughter for the crown, which forced Isabella into a civil war. That drama blows the roof off any season finale of The Bachelorette. The Muslims on the southern edge of Spain only had a shadow of their former power, so there was no repeat of an Islamic conquest during a succession crisis. Ferdinand and Isabella won out and secured their position as rulers. Letting a woman inherit the throne became a huge controversy, so everyone turned to the church in its role as the medieval UN. Church officials worked out a compromise. Ferdinand and Isabella would rule as joint monarchs. Castile and Aragon functionally merged to form modern Spain. Portugal also cemented its position as a separate kingdom, gave up all rights to Spain, and got exploration rights in Africa as part of the deal. Now that the transition of power had shaken out, just one more thing remained on the list. Take Grenada and complete the Reconquista. Ferdinand and Isabella waited for an opportune moment, then started the final drive to push Islam out of Spain. The monarch spent the 1480s retaking Grenada for Spain after nearly 800 years of Islamic rule. It was a decade of brutal fighting. On January 2nd, 1492, the last Islamic king surrendered his last fort in Spain. 781 years after the Moors crossed Gibraltar, the Reconquista was complete. The wealth gained from taking Grenada, the elimination of the threat of Islam in Western Europe, and the unification of Spain ushered in a golden age. Thanks in part to Spain and Portugal holding the line, Europe was almost back up to full strength. The world entered a time of dramatic change. We call it the Renaissance. Finishing the Reconquista also freed up resources to fund an intriguing proposition by an Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus. From Pelayo and Charles Martel to Ferdinand and Isabella, roughly 20 generations fought to retake Spain. They all met their rendezvous with destiny and preserved hope. Not just for Spain, for the whole Western world. Hope that Europe could return to greatness after Rome, and hope that Christianity could survive alongside Islam. To this day, Spain and Portugal are free Christian nations who control their ancient homeland. Their sacrifice greatly helped pave the way for the modern West. The Reconquista played a fundamental role in forming the national character of Spain and Portugal. For nearly 800 years, they simply refused to surrender to fate as a conquered people. This episode is dedicated to the many generations of Spanish and Portuguese people who fought for their beliefs and their homeland. I left off where most high school history books begin, but the Reconquista ties into so many events. It heavily influenced the Crusader mindset that defined medieval times. The age of exploration was only possible because the Reconquista largely eliminated Spain and Portugal's existential threat at home. The extended contact with Islamic civilization at its height gave Spain and Portugal access to ship designs and navigation far beyond what the rest of Europe had. The Reconquista is also a major reason why the Spanish and Portuguese put such an emphasis on spreading Christianity during colonization. To them, it was a continuation of the mission. The Reconquista also forced Spain and Portugal to come into their own as world powers about a century before the rest of Western Europe, which is why they were the first ones to begin overseas colonization. Beyond Spain and Portugal, the Reconquista played a massive role in setting up the tense dynamic between the West and the Islamic world, which is still a major factor today. Ferdinand and Isabella are buried together in Granada precisely because it is where they finished the Reconquista together. To mark the occasion, they had the royal chapel in Granada built, and it is the structure where they are interred. Ferdinand and Isabella's daughter was Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. Their granddaughter Mary was Queen Elizabeth's half-sister, and her main rival for the English throne. Henry VIII really screwed over Ferdinand and Isabella's descendants, who were also part of the Spanish king's family. It is a major reason why the Spanish got angry enough to assemble the Spanish Armada. Ferdinand and Isabella's other famous grandkid is Charles V. He inherited a huge portion of Europe due to his pedigree and oversaw Spain's colonization of the Americas. It was Charles V who sent Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro on their missions to the New World. He is the reason why much of Latin America is Catholic to this day. For those of you that remember the episode on Bartolome de las Casas, he grew up in Spain during the push to take Granada. The kings he pled to on behalf of the natives were Ferdinand and Charles V. If you have not heard it yet, go to episode 5. The link is in the description. On a more modern note, in Spain there are calls for a second Reconquista in response to the migrant crisis in Europe. With Muslims flooding into Spain from the Mediterranean, it is easy to understand how that situation could sound a bit too familiar. No matter what you believe about how to handle the migrant crisis, one thing is undeniable. Spain has quite a past on the issue. For those of you that want more details about the Reconquista, I recommend several sources. If you want the SportsCenter highlights, God's War by Christopher Tyerman has a chapter on the Reconquista. It is the same book I recommended for the Crusades. For play-by-play coverage and commentary, take a look at A History of Medieval Spain by Joseph O'Callaghan. It follows the Reconquista from Roman times to Ferdinand and Isabella in high detail from both the Christian and Islamic perspectives. Medieval Iberia by Olivia Constable is another one-stop shop and is made almost entirely out of primary sources from a variety of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish writers. If you are doing research or just want to hear it straight from the horse's mouth, this book is a goldmine. This one is more similar to player interviews at the post-game press conference. As always, we would love to hear your feedback and topic requests. Please comment, like, and share, or leave a review on iTunes so we can reach more people. You can also email us directly at historynachos@gmail.com. We have pages on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Patreon, and PayPal. For technological reasons, the older episodes are not on iTunes and SoundCloud, but are still freely available on YouTube. Please consider making a donation to support making more episodes. Any amount is greatly appreciated. The links to everything are in the description. Until next time, thanks for listening.